A coronavirus lab leak was treated like a conspiracy theory, and it's all Trump's fault. Wait, is that true? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. One of the biggest stories of the past few weeks is how the coronavirus could have been leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Everyone's talking about it, now that talking about it no longer gets you banished to Alex Jones land. If you want to learn about the evidence for the lab leak hypothesis, check out this episode of our other channel, China Uncensored. Today I'm going to talk about a different lab leak scandal. How America's mainstream media spectacularly dropped the ball when it came to this story. The media didn't just drop the ball. They took the ball, ran it into their own end zone, and then did a touchdown dance. All while not realizing that they had actually scored for the Chinese Communist Party. But now, the Wuhan lab leak has gone from a debunked conspiracy theory to suddenly credible, according to fact checkers. And people are describing the media's actions using words like fiasco and debacle. Clearly, now is the time for the media to do some soul searching, admit their mistakes, and figure out how to do better. Nah, instead the media are blaming their favorite villain, Pickle Rick. Okay, we all know it's Donald Trump. Throughout much of the pandemic, the lab leak hypothesis has been ridiculed by scientists as a baseless conspiracy theory fueled by President Donald Trump in an effort to deflect attention from his administration's botched pandemic response. Until last month, this was the accepted narrative when it came to the lab leak idea. Forget the COVID vaccine. For mainstream media, the best coronavirus shot in the arm is blaming Trump. Gotta save those sinking ratings somehow. Sure, the media already didn't trust Trump, which muddled their reporting. But that's completely Trump's fault. One Washington Post article generously admitted that some of the media overcorrected when it came to the lab leak theory. So the media called a bunch of stuff Trump said conspiracy theories. But that doesn't rule out that there was indeed some kind of conspiracy involved that we might not know about. Think about that for a moment. The writer is arguing that just because the media called something a conspiracy theory doesn't mean it couldn't be true. Right. Which is why when the Washington Post called the lab leak a debunked conspiracy theory, they meant it could still be true. That's clearly what everyone reading the headline would think. But perhaps the best take on the lab leak idea came from this ABC reporter.
This was an idea that was first put forward by Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, Donald Trump. And look, some things may be true even if Donald Trump said them.
That's a brave admission. Given that if Trump said the sky is blue, you'd probably see fact checkers saying the sky is actually colorless and the light from the sun bouncing off the air makes it appear blue. That was a joke, but the media did once run a story about how the Trump administration literally said the sky isn't blue, which is not at all what happened. Anyway, the narrative is that Trump's lack of credibility is what caused the media to dismiss the Wuhan lab leak hypothesis. But that narrative leaves some important information out. Which means it's time for everyone's favorite America Uncovered segment. Wait, is that true? Right after the break. Is it too much to hope that you saw an ad during that break? YouTube demonetizes a lot of our episodes, especially about the coronavirus, which is why we rely on your support. Visit patreon.com/America Uncovered. So a lot of reporters are saying it's Trump's fault that the media dismissed the Wuhan lab leak story last year. But is that true? Many media are having a hard time with the idea that Trump may have actually been right about the lab leak. In fact, they're the living embodiment of this clickhole article. It's supposed to be satire, but in this case it's true. But Trump wasn't the first US official to talk about the lab leak idea. In fact, he didn't even start talking about it until April 2020. That was months after the idea was already out there. On January 30th, 2020, Senator Tom Cotton brought up the Wuhan lab during a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing.
I want to talk about the biggest and the most important story in the world, the Wuhan coronavirus. This coronavirus is a catastrophe on the scale of Chernobyl for China. But actually, it's probably worse than Chernobyl, which was localized in its effect. The coronavirus could result in a global pandemic. I would note that Wuhan also has China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that works with the world's most deadly pathogens to include, yes, coronavirus.
It's not clear where Cotton got his information, but the Daily Mail had already run an article pointing out the existence of the Wuhan lab. And Chinese social media users had been talking about the Wuhan lab since early January. Remember, this was really early on in the pandemic. In fact, we technically weren't even in a pandemic yet. Only 10 days before Cotton's speech, the Chinese government had finally admitted that there was human-to-human transmission of the virus, after covering it up for weeks. So Senator Tom Cotton talking about a global Chernobyl was seen as extreme, and the media mocked him for it, in ways that have not aged well. The Huffington Post told readers not to listen to Cotton, because he was calling for all Americans in China to get out now, demanding the U.S. implement an extensive travel ban targeting China, and proposing a Manhattan Project-level effort to create a vaccine. Ha ha! What crazy ideas. So basically, Cotton was sounding the alarm about the dangers posed to the world by the actions of the Chinese Communist Party, and he was being mocked and ignored. I can relate. But the Huffington Post didn't just mock Senator Cotton. They also did something that doomed the Wuhan lab leak theory from the start. They conflated it with another theory, the idea the coronavirus had been developed by China as a bioweapon. Cotton also suggested the coronavirus could have come from a Chinese super laboratory that works with the world's most deadly pathogens, boosting a debunked fringe theory circulating among tabloids and conservative media outlets, suggesting the virus could be linked to a biowarfare program. Cotton didn't say anything about a biowarfare program, but the media would continue to imply that he did, like in this Business Insider article. It didn't directly attribute the biowarfare theory to Cotton, but said that Cotton's questions about the origins of the virus come amid numerous conspiracy theories, including the one about the biowarfare program. That's like saying Chris doesn't like cupcakes. At the same time, other people don't like donuts, which are also baked goods. Therefore, Chris probably doesn't like donuts. Now I kind of want a donut. Anyway, in early February, CBS News interviewed Chinese Ambassador Sui Tiankai and asked him a question about Senator Cotton's statements.
Senator Tom Cotton, who sits on the Senate Intelligence and Armed Services Committee, suggested that the virus may have come from China's biological warfare program. That's an extraordinary charge. How do you respond to that?
That is an extraordinary charge. Again, one that Cotton did not make. But it gave Ambassador Cui the opportunity to talk about racism.
It's very harmful, it's very dangerous to stir up suspicion, rumors, and spread them among the people. For one thing, this will create panic. Another thing is that it will fan up racial discrimination, xenophobia, all these things that will really harm our joint efforts to combat the virus.
So now, the lab leak hypothesis has been linked to both a biowarfare program and to racism and xenophobia, all of which handed the Chinese Communist Party a huge propaganda victory and helped them bury the lab leak hypothesis for more than a year. And all this led to this infamous Washington Post article accusing Tom Cotton of repeating a debunked conspiracy theory. It again accuses Cotton of spreading a fringe theory. In the article, the words fringe theory are hyperlinked to another Washington Post article about weapons research. So again, the media is conflating the lab leak hypothesis with the biowarfare hypothesis. But that's not the worst thing about the Washington Post's reporting. Among other scientists, the article cites Richard Ebright, a professor of chemical biology at Rutgers University, to debunk this so-called fringe theory. Ebright says the virus was definitely not a deliberately released bioweapon. But the weird thing is, Ebright has since been quoted multiple times as one of the biggest supporters of a lab leak hypothesis. He says it's been the strongest possibility since January 2020. So why is Ebright quoted in the Washington Post debunking Cotton's lab leak hypothesis when Ebright actually supports it? Well, Ebright told independent journalist Michael Tracy that he spoke to the Washington Post twice. He told them that he did not believe the virus was engineered, but that he was willing to go on record that the coronavirus outbreak could be the result of a lab accident. Ebright said he was surprised to see that he had only been quoted in the article on the bioweapon issue, and not the lab accident hypothesis. So this Washington Post article didn't just claim that Tom Cotton was wrong because they talked to a bunch of scientists who all said that Tom Cotton was wrong. They also talked to at least one scientist who said the lab leak was possible. In other words, Cotton could be right. And instead of quoting him on that, they used his words to make it sound like Cotton was wrong. Now, we don't know why the Washington Post did this. It could have been on purpose or just carelessness. But that one action helped suppress the coverage of the lab leak hypothesis for more than a year. And it gets worse. Right after the break. Welcome back. By early February of 2020, the media had repeatedly conflated the lab leak hypothesis with the idea of a Chinese bioweapon, debunked it because of that conflation, and then linked it to racism and xenophobia, all before President Trump had publicly mentioned the idea. But probably the most influential expert to dismiss the idea of a lab leak was Dr. Peter Daszak. Daszak coordinated and wrote a letter published in The Lancet on February 19, 2020, signed by other virologists and scientists. It says, "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories, suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin." But Daszak was also working with EcoHealth Alliance, an organization that was getting U.S. government grants to study coronaviruses. And EcoHealth Alliance was giving that money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to perform that research. So Daszak had a massive conflict of interest. Despite this conflict, Daszak declared he had no competing interests. And he was repeatedly quoted by media outlets as an expert who debunked the idea the coronavirus could have come from a lab. For some reason, it took almost a year, when Daszak was included on the World Health Organization's team that went to China, for the media to start covering his conflicts of interest. Meanwhile, thanks in large part to Daszak's early letter, the media reported that there was a scientific consensus the lab leak hypothesis was wrong, when in fact, there was not a consensus. All along, there have been scientists, like Richard Ebright, who have said a lab leak was very possible. They just didn't get much airtime. Then in mid-April, Trump started talking about the Wuhan lab leak idea. That was after Washington Post columnist Josh Rogin published a story on how U.S. officials had visited the Wuhan lab in 2018 and found serious safety issues. Rogin is one of the few journalists who have been talking about the lab leak since the beginning. He quoted a Trump administration official as saying there was a lot more evidence for the lab leak idea than the natural occurrence idea. And when Trump himself started saying there was evidence of a lab leak, the media immediately set it up as Trump versus experts. Of course, the experts must be correct. We now know that the media weren't listening to all the experts. But once the Trump administration started talking about this lab leak idea, the media treated it as morally reprehensible. Trump's use of terms like the China virus made it easy to again link the lab leak theory to racism and xenophobia. No one ever accused Trump of being too tactful. But the result was that anyone who mentioned the possibility of the lab leak was discredited and ignored. A group of scientists tried to get attention for it, but faced repeated rejections from scientific journals. It was so bad that former CDC Director Robert Redfield said he was getting death threats. But the problem with how the media covered the Wuhan lab leak hypothesis isn't Trump or Cotton or even Daszak. The problem is that in our politically correct culture, who says something is more important than what is said. Under this political correctness culture, the first way of discrediting an argument is to instead discredit the person. And when it comes to Trump, well, whatever he says is automatically discredited. So if Trump finds something credible, reporters will not. Then the argument gets linked to Trump, and then anyone else who makes the same argument gets discredited because they made the same point as Trump. It's a never-ending cycle, which is great, at least for CNN's ratings. So what do you think about the Wuhan lab leak hypothesis and how it was covered by the media? Let me know in the comments below. And thanks for watching this episode of America Uncovered.